Hello friends, fans, and dairy products of all ages. This is Cheese of Ages here, and today we're here with another episode of Taking5, in which I take shots at Taking20's videos on why he's quitting Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And, spoiler warning, it's because he's playing it wrong. In my previous video, I talked about how he's under the impression that Pathfinder 2nd Edition, a game that won't shut up about role-playing, isn't a role-playing system, and how he proclaims that his table runs skills, how the game in multiple places tells you not to run them. And, in fact, an example of this is a skill that does not function even at a rudimentary level without roleplay involved, unless you're not running it correctly. So, while we're on the subject of fundamentally flawed arguments that fall apart at the most cursory examination of the rules, let's start talking about his second video and his apparently irreproachable, incontrovertible sample battle that just immediately, on just a cursory evaluation of what his example is trying to do and how he's trying to do it, falls apart almost immediately with only the slightest, most minimum application of common sense. If you are trying to prove an illusion of choice in combat, you do not do so with any validity by deliberately making a one-trick pony and declaring as much multiple times. And you especially do not do so by building a one-trick pony in a suboptimum way that strips it of things that would make it better at that one trick and also diversify its options. His build is so allergic to things that would diversify his options, it literally makes its one trick slightly, very minutely, mind you, worse. So, let's just set aside for the time being how invalid his example is by proxy of deliberately building a one-trick pony to prove a lack of options in combat in the system in general, which proves nothing. If you deliberately build something that only does one thing in combat, you're not proving that the system is devoid of options in combat. You're literally declaring and demonstrating and multiple times announcing that you are removing options and not taking options that would give you more options. Just in the second level feat slot alone, there are 4 other feats you could take, multiple ones of which would give you more things you could do in combat. So, yeah. You just fail immediately out of the gate. Right out of the get-go. But let's put that aside, that conceptually his example doesn't prove what he's trying to prove. Just on a fundamental level, it cannot. He also gets a terrible amount of rules wrong, and also presents technically correct information that is influenced by bias, poor system mastery, and is deceptive. In some cases, outright, he makes up rules that do not actually exist in the game and presents them as fact, which will make the example turns much worse than they would actually be. But we'll get back to that a little bit later in the example turn. First, we've got to go over a couple of points. First of all, on at least 2 occasions, he mentions that the ranger picks the ranged option as far as Hunter's Edge goes, and that he can't take the melee option to get the Hunter's Edge on his melee attack, when that is not the case. That is not true. Go check. There's no actual thing of the Hunt Prey action, or the Hunter's Edge, or the one that he picked, or any of them, in fact, as of the publishing of this video, that specifies a weapon type. He declares on multiple occasions that he picked the bow option, the ranged option, and thus does not have it for melee, which is not the case. Therefore, he plays his melee turn in a subpar way, and thus misrepresents the math. He made a big deal about damage difference between 2 attacks. 2 attacks being a single attack from a longbow and a single attack from a short sword, both of which are facts that we need to go into depth in. For one, longbow. He's using a longbow in both the ranged case example and the every range he uses the longbow in, he does not apply the math correctly. He does not apply the volley property of the longbow. That math is not correct. He's applying the full modifier without the volley property's -2 penalty for shooting at a target within 30 feet. Therefore, his sample ranged turn, the first action should have been move away to 30 feet, hunt prey, make an attack. So we're just going to nudge that to what he should have been using in that example case, to a short bow, which is a D6 weapon that is otherwise identical aside from lacking the volley property. And this isn't too much of a damage difference between a 1d6 and the average damage between a 1d6 and a 1d8 attack is just a singular point of damage on average. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, in his example battle, he declared that the damage difference between one attack at range and in melee was 60%. Just the first attack was 60%. If you're not aware that he was talking 60% for just the one attack, go back and listen to the video. He's in fact displaying 60% for a singular attack. And he was comparing a longbow to a short sword. Even with critting playing a factor into that, if the average result difference between a D6 and a D8 is only 1 point, how is that a 60% decrease in damage to the D6 weapon? Well, set aside the fact that you should be using a short bow, and so it's comparing a D6 weapon to a D6 weapon, that's calling back to a couple of factors. One, in his sample melee turn, his turn executed with the mechanics correct should have been hunt prey, move, quick draw strike, not move, quick draw strike, strike. This does have a factor of you can't crit on the second attack if you didn't crit on the first, but the Hunter's Mark would provide a D6 plus a D8, which could theoretically crit, thus increasing the damage, overall average damage. And remember, we're comparing the average damage on the first attack. We're comparing a D8 longbow to a D6 short sword, or with the math adjusted to be correct, we're comparing a D6 short bow to a D6 short sword. So he should be dealing a D6 plus a D8 compared to a D6 plus a D8. So you're thinking, oh, well, does a singular D8 of the Hunter's Mark actually create the full gap of the 60% decrease in damage? No, actually, he creates that. This is a symptom of poor system mastery. He selects to go with a short sword instead of a rapier, on the premise that if he runs into something with piercing resistance, he would only have piercing damage if he had a bow and a rapier, which is not the case. Everyone in the game has bare minimum D4 unarmed strikes that they are equally proficient in, do not provoke attacks of opportunity for using, and progress in proficiency along with their primary weapon. And this is a D4 agile finesse weapon. And, as you might recall, between dice sizes, the average damage is only 1 point of difference. So a D4 compared to a D6 is roughly the same thing in the grand scheme of things. There's a slightly higher damage ceiling, but he does not need to go a short sword instead of a rapier to diversify damage types. That is a misunderstanding of system mastery, so there is no reason to not go the rapier. So in comparing a D6 with a D8 to a D6 with a D8, the deadly property is something that you could easily just have. You could grab a rapier instead of a short sword, and now you're comparing a D6 weapon with deadly D8 to with a plus D8 hunter's mark. Hunt prey, hunter's edge, to the same thing. So, in fact, there's not a full-on 60% damage increase, in part because he's not applying the mechanics correctly, and second, because he's not actually using a rapier, which you could easily use without any distinct mechanical drawback whatsoever. And know that with just a barely moderate amount of system mastery. So, yeah, the 60% damage fall off is because he's not playing the game correctly. Though in his defense, at 5th level, if he had actually employed magic items, there would be a little issue when you acquire a +1 striking short bow and you haven't acquired a +1 striking rapier. You'll have one more damage die with your short bow. And of course, if you're relying on 2 melee weapons for your melee damage options, you're very well not going to have a striking rune for your fist. So when you need to do a blunt damage, your melee weapon is the rapier, not the fist. So there is some mild issues there. But overall, piercing resistance is relatively uncommon, so it's kind of a moot point. Speaking of moot points, it gets worse than that. He's putting forth this character, and excuse the popping of my microphone. He's putting this character forth. The concept is a guy that just wants to be good at bows, and conceptually is a hunter. And at least when he decides what feat he's going to pick, at the point at which he picks Hefty Holler, at least at that point, he decides to pick Hefty Holler because he likes the image of a hunter carrying his prey back to camp. Now, you're perfectly justified in saying that his reasoning for picking the Hefty Holler feat doesn't necessarily apply to his character concept. He doesn't necessarily like the image of having the carrying capacity to carry his prey back to camp. But inherently, if he likes the image of carrying his prey back to camp, why is his strength bare minimum at 5th level? He's had 2 chances, more than 2 chances in fact, to increase it above 10. 10 is the lowest it can be without picking an ancestry that has a flaw in it. So let's break this down. What this meant, what it means he did to have a strength of 10 at 5th level. The logic he would have to apply. So, starting all stats at 10, it would make sense that he would pick ancestry and background options that would give him boosts to his dexterity and wisdom, as ancestry, which is race, and background give you certain ability score boosts, which raise your ability score by 2 points. And you can't boost the same score twice in the same step, ever. So, ancestry can come with 2 or 3. If it comes with 3, it usually comes with a flaw to balance it out. Background normally comes with 2 ability boosts, one of which has to be picked between 2 options. The other one is usually free. In fact, always free. Then you get a 1 based on your class, a singular 1. And then at the end of that, you get 4 free boosts that have to be to 4 separate scores. Now, it makes sense with ancestry and background that he would pick to go solely Dex Wisdom, even though one of those can swap out swap out Wisdom for Strength easily and not affect viability so much. But let's assume he got 2 boosts to Wisdom in those 2 steps, putting him at 14. At this point, this Wisdom is completely usable for a non-caster class, because you are not far away from the DCs you would need to be at any point, and DCs don't scale up drastically in difficulty because your proficiency level always goes up. It scales at the same rate. So if it's viable now, it's usually viable for forever, as long as you keep your proficiency scaled up and keep your score within 1 or 2 boosts of your highest score. And when you hit 18 in a score, boosts only raise it by 1 point. So, once you, if you exit a character creation with a score of 16 in something, you've pretty much hit the efficiency cap on that score straight at level 5 if you put another boost in it. But we'll hit back on that later. So entering into the final phase with the 4 free boosts, we're assuming he went Dex Wisdom for his boosts from his most of his boosts from his ancestry and background, which would put his Wisdom at 14, which is usable. But let's put that aside. And the 4 free boosts. Logically, the first one he's going to spend is going to be on his primary attacking score, Dexterity. And while 14 is usable, it makes perfect sense to want to be particularly good at that, as it's used for initiative, spotting things. It can be used to identify 10 out of the 18 types of monster in the game via the nature and religion skills. So it's perfectly viable to want come out of character creation with a 16 in that, even though it's high, even though it's unnecessarily high in most cases for that purpose, and 14 is usable for those purposes. It also does will saves, but again, it's acceptable to want this at 16. So Dex, Wisdom, makes sense. Constitution, even if you're ranged, occasionally you're going to get hit with damage and its fort save boosts, so one there is perfectly reasonable. Especially if you picked Elf, that has a con flaw, so you need to get rid of that. You don't need to have freaking negative hit points every level and a negative to your fortitude save. That's bad news. But you could skip that if you wanted to be really risky. But after all that rambling, we have one more. And we can't put it in Dex, we can't put it in Wisdom, we can't put it in Constitution. So, what do we put this freaking last boost in if we want to play a hunter character that's all wilderness survival-y and wants to hunt his prey and carry it back to his camp? Are we going to put it in the charisma score? No, we're not really a social character, are we? It doesn't really make any sense. We're a hermit living in the woods off the lands by ourselves. We're a loner archetype. Oh, maybe intelligence, because that would make us slightly better at identifying the 8 out of 18 monsters that we have to use an intelligence score on. And lore is slightly better for identifying things and recalling knowledge for reasons. And it would give us another skill, especially if we picked an elf, we'd have it starting with a 12 in it. So intelligence is technically a viable choice here, because a 14 intelligence is nice. Or we could put it in the strength score, and although 12 is not super great now, that would give us 1 more damage in melee if we ever needed to go into melee. Also make us slightly better at athletics, which is used for jumping and climbing and swimming, things you do in the woods. And it would increase our bulk limit by 1, so we'd be able to carry our kills back to camp a little bit more easy. Intelligence is viable, but strength does so much. And it would also enable us to be viable at some point with combat maneuvers, maybe. With a little assistance, maybe the right items. So, if you picked strength to build this character, hey, good on you. He picked to put it in something besides that, probably intelligence. Which, sure, fair enough. I argued some good points for it. Getting a 5th level to 14 strength makes it actually reasonably viable to use athletics consistently on the average enemies we'll fight that are lower level than us, like the whites in the example for example. But hey, fair enough. Now, at 5th level, we get 4 more boosts of the same style, where they have to go into 4 different scores. So naturally, we're going to apply the same logic. We're going to put 1 in our primary attacking stat. We're going to put 1 in Wisdom, even when we have a 16 by this point, which is perfectly adequate and could wait. It makes sense to want to be good at it. Now we've hit that 18 cap really early. And now that we've achieved that 18 score and that 4 modifier, It's going to be another 10 levels before we see an increase in our modifier, because our next boost at 10th level isn't going to increase our ability score to an even number. So it'll be 2 boosts later at 15, in which we gain our +5 to it. Which, honestly, if we didn't pick a wisdom boost here, it would be 20th level until we get that +5. And honestly, the 20th level boosts are irrelevant. Though it's worth noting that because we hit an even number at 15, it's pointless to boost wisdom again at the 20th level point, because it'll just raise it to 21 and not increase the modifier. But let it be stated that it's worth boosting wisdom here in theory, because while that +1 is kind of unnecessary, you'll effectively never get it if you don't pick a wisdom boost here. And next modifier, Constitution, still makes sense, even though at this point you can start considering maybe going a little glass cannon-y. We'll say that a 14 is a reasonably solid option for having a Constitution even on an archer, because honestly it is. But from here on, you can start considering skipping Constitution if you want to. Now, what are we putting this final point in? Well, in his example case, the 5th level ranger has a strength of 10. So, instead of just putting both of those points that he put in intelligence, or maybe charisma, probably intelligence, he could have had both of those in strength, and instead of hefty hauler, took something else. Like, for instance, a skill feat that gives you the ability to set traps, which is something a hunter would really like to do, and would diversify your options much. And you can even build some ranger options to that, to give you, even now, the ability to set a trap outside and then teleport into the room, or set up ambushes with the traps, or you could make yourself slightly faster, or be able to craft alchemical things like grenades or healing reagents, like some herbalist, like how Aragorn in Lord of the Rings was able to craft the King's Foil antidote to the stabby situation in Lord of the Rings. You could even use that slot for the ability to trick magic item and be able to use primal spell wands and scrolls. But no, he didn't have any things in strength, but wanted to carry shit, so he needs to take hefty hauler instead of something that would diversify his options. Weird that. I mean, and it's not like he's actually using that intelligence for anything, considering his default first turn is not, in fact, hunt prey, recall knowledge, hunted shot. Let's just presume he's fought whites before and doesn't need to recall knowledge, and give him that advantage. Oh, wait, whoopsie. You use religion for recalling information against undead, which is a wisdom skill, not intelligence. So unless you were using a lore-related skill, there's actually no reason to use intelligence here at all in this fight. We'll shove that aside and say in other battles in which you would need to use intelligence to recall knowledge about the animal or thing you're fighting, not specifically animals, because that's wisdom too, it would be good to have that intelligence. Not in this battle, but some battles. With the 8 of 18 monsters, you can't use wisdom to identify the monster with I'm digging a hole. Let's move on. So anyway, I went on this tangent about his ability scores off the back of that talk about using the off of his saying melee was really terrible, even though he could have comparable weapon, because strength is added to damage. Even with just the 12, he could have 1 more damage. If he had a 14 strength, or the easily obtained 16 strength by this point, or the technically achievable, not all that difficultly 18 strength, he could have anywhere from 1 to 4 additional damage on that melee attack, and with a composite bow, anywhere from 1 to 2 additional damage on his ranged attacks. So not only is having a stat distribution so bizarrely allergic to strength, which is a sensible score for a woodsman to have at least some investment in, he's not only narrowing his options, he's weakening his bow use very minutely. So, that 60% damage fall off, it's misleading. Extremely misleading. So, first turn, not using the right weapon. And the weapon he's using that he declares he's using several times, he's not applying the math to correctly. It should be taking a -2. When he's comparing the first turn to the second, he's not playing the second turn correctly because he's not applying the hunter's mark. And thus, the 60% damage fall off that he makes such a big deal about is only because of choices he made that aren't mathematically accurate to the rules and also are completely avoidable with no mechanical drawbacks whatsoever. And aren't even really, are only the noobest of noob mistakes. Because somebody could just see that their unarmed strike does a d4 damage and say, oh, well, I can just pick up a rapier because I can punch them if I run into a piercing resistance. That's not insanely advanced technical stuff here. And now the freaking fourth turn. The fourth turn, in which he executes combat maneuvers with his weirdly 10 strength. He does a trip, which flatfoots and prones flat-footing you. This gives you a -2 to AC from being prone, flat-footing you, and prone also gives you a -2 penalty to melee attacking. And then, if you stand up from prone, you trigger reactions from anyone with an ability similar to attack of opportunity, i.e. triggers a reaction off of movement. And he follows up this trip next to a fighter that has attack of opportunity by randomly belly flopping onto the ground for no reason and then grappling his target, preventing them from standing up and attacking and provoking an attack of opportunity. When all grappling does is keep them from moving and flatfoot them. So the grappling didn't flatfoot because they're already flatfooted, and keeps them from standing up and provoking an attack of opportunity. And apparently, you have to belly flop onto the ground and flatfoot yourself to negate the -2 penalty to attacking you. Oh wait, that's actually not a rule. You can grapple a prone target without belly flopping randomly onto the ground. I don't know why he thinks you have to headbutt the ground face first in order to grapple a prone target. That's not even a thing in real life martial arts. You can keep a person on the ground without being on the ground with them. It's just plain fact. It's harder, but it's not something that's an impossibility. But he decides to make up that rule that isn't in the books anywhere and present it as fact and negate a bonus to an action that would not normally be negated when following the rules. So you wait a minute. His melee turn is worse because he's not playing the game right, and he didn't build the character right. And his combat maneuver turn, that he proceeded by making fun of people saying that athletics combat maneuvers diversify the combat system. He made fun of those people before doing a misguided, insane, pointless, thrown-together turn that nobody sane would do. Self-sabotaged his initial maneuver, and then made up a rule to make that self-sabotaging even worse. What about this sample battle? Math is something you can only refute with bad faith arguments. The damage difference you harp on as being an insane big deal is misleading and can be easily outright non-existent. Certainly, standing there and firing a bunch of attacks with your short bow does in fact have a higher maximum potential damage than moving up and engaging with that singular attack in melee, but that singular attack only has any damage difference whatsoever because you're not building the character right, and you decided to get the ranger rules wrong, because you apparently really researched this well, and you... did I mention having no strength? Because that's an important big deal, because, like, literally you're dealing more damage with a rapier with a proper strength level with that singular attack. It's literally not only is there not a damage fall off, there's a damage increase on a singular attack level. And you know what the big damage difference is between a big flurry of attacks from your bow and moving in to engage in melee? By his own math, those next two attacks only have an average damage of combined around 5. So, yeah, if you have strength, that damage difference is lowered by 2 because you're hitting for 2 damage in melee with the plus 14. If you have a composite longbow, that's only damage lowered by 1. But you easily achieve a 13 strength, which would lower it by 3, only 2 if you have a composite longbow, and still only by 2 if you have an 18 strength and a composite bow, because the composite bow would have 2 damage instead of the 1 from being the modifier being halved. And if you have an 18 strength, which is reasonably achievable, you have an extra 4 damage on that melee attack, with the average damage between the ranged and melee flurries being 5. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the flurry of short bow strikes doesn't have much higher potential max damage, but I'm just saying, according to his own math, the average damage difference isn't all that significant. And note that after that first turn, unless that enemy that you ran to dropped, you're making the same number of melee attacks now that you're engaged as you were from a distance. So the damage difference disappears completely because you're making the same amount of attacks you would be if you'd stayed back. This is, of course, barring any difference in striking rune level, but those periods of time will be narrow at best, as usually you'll find appropriate gear or be able to acquire it if your DM is following the typical treasure by level chart. It's not going to be a very long period of time in which you're going to have a striking rune gap. Unless, of course, we're talking about having a bow, a rapier, and a fist. But again, we've gone over that. This isn't to say that you're not going to be better with your short bow than you're going to be with a rapier. You have a feat in it. You have the ability to, as one action, do 2 attacks, applying multiple attack penalty normally for each attack, but combining their damage for the purposes of resistances. Meanwhile, you don't have that for the short sword. That third attack that you're going to be able to do while hunter's marking, and then using your hunted shot, is almost never going to hit, but theoretically it can, and you can still do 3 attacks. The main draw of hunted shot really isn't spamming attacks, though, because of the accuracy. It's for the capacity to do multiple actions without losing attacks. So, yeah. Maybe do some other things in combat rather than wasting a turn on an attack that will almost never hit. Move. Do a recall knowledge check about the creature. Be built correctly and do some kind of athletics maneuver. Build differently and freaking have charisma-based things so you can instill fear and intimidate. Take some sort of freaking dedication feat that grants you access to cantrips, so on turns where you have the mark in play, you can do a spell and then 2 attacks. Do something, anything, aside from throw your third action away knowing it probably won't succeed 99% of the time, and then blame the system for it. and then later decide, hey, I'm going to make a YouTube video demonstrating how I'm playing mechanics of the system wrong, proclaim my players are doing something that is a noob mistake and they shouldn't be doing, and then I'm going to make a response video yelling at people for assuming what I was saying was accurate, and then demonstrate how even further I'm getting everything wrong by portraying this example battle as flawless and immune to legitimate criticism, even though I'm getting class mechanics wrong, pointlessly putting the characters against a monster that requires I give the 5e ranger a magic item, even though the type of monster didn't matter and I could have just put a generic one in there and avoided that. And then I'm gonna freaking do things getting the wrong weapon. Then I'm going to make fun of you making legitimate comments about actions. I'm going to self-sabotage that turn, demonstrating those actions in a way, making a turn that nobody would logically do. And then I'm going to make up a rule that isn't in the system and portray it as fact to make that even worse. Yeah, you might wonder why my tone is a bit hostile at times, and I might seem to be aggressively attacking his points in a somewhat personal tone. Well, that's because of all these points I just made. That's because you're freaking acting like an unassailable expert because of the 2 videos you've made on your otherwise D&D 5th edition channel. Act like nobody can assail your points aside with bad faith arguments and that your math is flawless, even though your math's deceptive and the damage difference is completely avoidable with proper application of mechanics and selection of the right weapon. And where you build your character in a way counter to the actual concept you're putting forth, making the damage difference even more skewed towards the wrong weapon that you're using. You use the wrong weapon, you get class abilities wrong, you make up rules to make your already laughably poorly executed and non-actually representative combat maneuver turn that you made after you made fun of people for saying that athletics attacks add depth to the combat system, outright laughing at them. I'm going to have a personal tone when you portray rules falsely and portray them as these falsehoods as unassailable fact that only bad faith arguments can go up against. No. I can go up against them with legitimate arguments based on a basic comprehension of the basic rules. So, look at his channel and go to his little I'm quitting Pathfinder 2nd edition sample battle and both of the videos if you haven't seen them, and how he's seeing these freaking... Just look at his sample battle if you don't want to go through the trouble of watching both of the videos. And look at what he's portraying as the default, how every battle plays out. Then go watch any video from somebody that's primarily a Pathfinder 2nd edition content creator. I can give a good example that contrasts these two right out of the gate. Watch his second video with his sample battle and how he regards as the most obvious option for the optimum ranged turn in his first option. Apparently, doing a pointless third action is the most obvious thing to do. And then go watch NOEZ video about top 5 player mistakes that you should avoid in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Spoilers, it's mostly about the freaking doing 3 attacks pointlessly because the third attack will mathematically never hit. And who'd think that the most obvious turn, according to freaking Taking5, is to do something that will obviously fail and in some cases get you attacked? That doesn't seem like the most obvious turn to me. Just compare the imagery of Taking5's view on the combat, and then compare it to that top 5 mistakes, how NOEZ, an actual dedicated player of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, portrays the combat, the imagery associated with it. You'll see how is Taking5 so far off base compared to NOEZ1's channel video. I mean, here on the side, Taking5 is describing combat as basically doing a barking seal impersonation, just slapping all the time, doing nothing but slapping, just slapping for hours. It's just nothing. It's the same thing all the time. And NOEZ1's over here, with its top 5 player mistakes video, is talking about all these strategic options and things you could choose to do. How is there such a discrepancy between this person that made 2 videos and played 2 games over the course of an entire year, while also playing D&D 5e games, compared to this person that plays mostly Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but also plays some other games, and his channel is entirely Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And I think he has another channel that's dedicated to other types of RPG, but I'm not entirely sure. I wonder if it's the fact that Taking5's videos are describing the default state of the game when played properly is almost a one-to-one description of common new player mistakes. From rolling roleplay wrong and just declaring actions without all of the associated gubbins the DM is supposed to run around them, and also spamming attacks pointlessly. It's almost like somebody didn't actually devote a year of their life to this game, and only devoted as much of their life as their channel conveys. Yes, I'm sorry, that's a personal attack, and I'm sorry, NOEZ1's. I know you said you want constructive, positive Pathfinder 2nd Edition content creation, but this guy's creating false rules and portraying them as fact, and freaking portraying noob mistake play as the default state of play and how it's correctly played and how it's supposed to be run. He's actively playing the game wrong and saying it's correct. I can't just not draw attention to that. If Taking5 is going to come out with something like that second video, ridiculing a game system and its players with inaccurate rules and things that borderline on outright lies, I'm going to have to come out with a video ridiculing him with facts and actual rules. So, yeah. My aggressive, angry tone is about him displaying that noob mistakes, mistaken incorrect play, as system mastery. He did not demonstrate illusion of choice with his sample battle. All he did was reinforce an illusion of system mastery. I can't entirely cast aside his points, because as the NOEZ1's video listing them as common noob mistakes would indicate, these are common new player mistakes. But when you start drawing those as some picture of the default way of playing the game that's true and accurate, and how the game is played, that's where I draw the line. Next video, we're probably going to talk about a example of illusion of choice in combat, with more and better examples. I can't entirely discount his ranged archery example, because yes, a lot of classes and certain combinations will fall to a specific pattern if there's nothing else to do in the combat. The fact that he continuously provided countless examples of fights in which the ranger has literally next to nothing available to do except shoot something. Yeah, I think he provided around at least 6 examples of a fight in a vacuum, including one that was a flying enemy, so literally he couldn't do anything but shoot the flying thing. Setting that aside, we'll approach this from more examples, including the fighter, which as early as level 1 can set into a pattern of doing only his 2 feats in combat, and the mid to high level barbarian build based on the whirlwind attack, which can easily descend on the barbarian basically just going into the room, shouting Demacia, and spinning for the rest of the fight. And then we're going to address things that about this that diversify combat options. Even though he mocked those and said, I'm doing this and it works every time, and people have already talked about that, we need to talk about this. We need to properly convey the actual system and address the actual illusion of choice he's trying and failing to convey correctly. Future videos might also include talks about the very short list of other points he made over the course of 30 seconds, in which he spent talking about them only in passing, and then in the next video ridiculed people for not addressing, even though in the previous video he said he wasn't talking about them. Apparently, according to the second video, he did bring them up and talk about them. So we've got to talk about those in a future video, as much as we can, considering only one of the points is actually made enough to actually refute, because several of the points he brought up he barely mentions and doesn't define clearly enough to argue against, because he doesn't make a point. So we're going to have to go over that. But for the time being, I've got to roll.